Today, we're following the money around Jared Kushner, Affinity Partners, Donald Trump, Saudi Arabia, and a web of business and political relationships stretching from the Gulf to Albania, Syria, Israel, and Gaza. Now, on the surface, these can look like separate stories, right? In a private investment firm, a luxury resort in Albania, a push to remove Syria sanctions, Israeli investment deals, post-war redevelopment plans, and Donald Trump's inner circle. But when you line up the reporting, the congressional letters, and the corporate relationships, a different picture starts to come into focus. This stops looking like a series of disconnected headlines, and it starts looking like a system. It looks like a system where foreign governments move money through a politically connected investment firm, where business partnerships overlap with diplomacy, and where influence may travel through private capital instead of the normal channels that the public knows how to track. And that is why this story matters, because this is not just a story about money, my friend. It is a story about leverage. So let's get into it. Welcome back to Radical Leftist Scum. I'm your host, Valdet Salimai. Now, before we get to Albania or Syria or Israel, let's just start with the part that is the hardest to dispute, the scale of this entire thing. In March 2026, Robert Garcia, who's a ranking member on the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, and Ron Wyden, ranking member on the Senate Committee of Finance, sent a letter to Affinity Partners' legal team. According to the Wyden-Garcia letter, Affinity Partners was managing roughly $3 billion in foreign money at the start of 2024, and around $4.8 billion by the end of that year. The same oversight material says that the firm collected about $157 million in fees from foreign clients, including about $87 million from the Saudi government. Then Bloomberg, as summarized by the Arabian Gulf Business Insight, reported that Affinity raised another $1.5 billion from the Qatar Investment Authority in Abu Dhabi-based Lunate. That means this is not just some boutique fund story. This is not small money either. This is billions of dollars from foreign aid state-linked sources flowing into the firm of a man directly tied to Donald Trump and, by 2025 and 2026, again connected to high-level diplomacy in the Middle East. Even Republicans weren't happy about this. Here's an important quote from that Wyden-Garcia letter. This arrangement has even drawn criticism from the president's own party. Recently, Republican Senator Tom Tillis raised concerns about Mr. Kushner and Mr. Witkoff's expansive roles in foreign policy, noting that, quote, they're not subject to Senate confirmation and they're not subject to oversight, end quote. When speaking of Mr. Kushner's relationship with the Saudi government, House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer himself previously acknowledged that, quote, what Kushner did crossed the line of ethics, end quote. So, the public interest question is obvious at this point. What exactly were these governments buying? Were they buying returns? That question gets sharper when you look at what congressional investigators found about the Saudi investment. That June 12, 2024 Wyden letter said Saudi Public Investment Fund staff viewed Affinity's operations as unsatisfactory, they considered the fees excessive, and they flagged the risk tied to Kushner himself. And yet, the investment still went through. And that part matters, friend. Because when professional staff reportedly see weak commercial logic and the money still moves, the public has to ask whether the real value was political rather than financial. And that suspicion has only grown because of later reporting, including from Popular Information and Middle East Eye, which framed the Saudi investment as part of a larger story about Kushner's close relationship with Mohammed bin Salman and the possibility that the money functioned as something more than a normal investment decision. In the Popular Information article, it's mentioned, and I quote, according to an investigation by the Senate Finance Committee, Affinity Partners ultimately secured about $3 billion in investments. Along with $2 billion from Saudi Arabia, Kushner secured additional funds from Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Taiwanese billionaire Terry Gou. There is a fifth foreign investor that Affinity Partners will not disclose. There are no U.S. investors. Now, this does not necessarily prove a crime, but it does raise a very serious democratic question. If a foreign government can place billions with a politically connected American insider despite major internal concerns, then the public should want to know what influence that money may have purchased. I want to know. At this point, it's important to take a step back and widen the frame, because this is not just a story about Jared Kushner having Saudi money around him. It is a story about a broader Trump political network that has maintained unusually close ties to Saudi power, while Saudi state-linked money flowed into Kushner's firm. And that matters because it makes the conflict harder to dismiss as one person's private business. It starts to look like a relationship structure. And according to this Reuters report, Trump is publicly tying major regional diplomacy to Saudi priorities, including saying he would not proceed with a nuclear deal unless Saudi Arabia joins the Abraham Accords. Now, the AP reporting and the BBC reporting add to that picture by showing how central Saudi Arabia remains to the broader regional bargaining now happening around Donald Trump. From the AP article that was just recently published on July 1st, 2026, and I quote, President Donald Trump has approved an agreement with Saudi Arabia that could potentially provide the kingdom with uranium enrichment capability for its civilian nuclear program. This is according to two people familiar with the matter, end quote. Now, put next to the existing Affinity story, and it raises a pretty dark question. What does it mean when the same foreign government can sit at the intersection of billions in state-linked investment into Kushner's firm, direct strategic value to Trump's regional agenda, and high-stakes negotiations over the political future of the Middle East? This is where the corruption argument becomes harder to avoid, because corruption in broad daylight does not always look like a briefcase full of cash. Sometimes it looks like policy positions, private investments, diplomatic access, and family-connected business relationships all moving in the same direction at the same time. And when that happens, the public has a right to ask whether this is foreign policy being made in the national interest, or whether it's foreign policy being shaped inside a network where the financial incentives are already baked in. And that, my friend, is the key point. The Saudi relationship is not background context. It's the spine of the story. Because if Saudi Arabia has leverage through money, leverage through diplomacy, and leverage through personal political relationships, then what you are looking at is not normal statecraft. You are looking at a system where influence and private gain may be operating side by side in full public view. Now bring in the Al-Khayyat brothers, because this is where the network really starts to expand. The website Semaphore describes Motaz and Ramez Al-Khayyat as Syrian-born brothers who left at the start of the Syrian civil war, and they built a giant Qatar-based conglomerate spanning construction, infrastructure, healthcare, hospitality, and international investment. These are not peripheral figures. They actually sit at the crossroads of Gulf business power and regional reconstruction politics. And they show up in one of the most concrete parts of this story, the Albania Resort Project. According to CBS News, the Sazan Island project involved Assets Group, which is run by the Al-Khayyat brothers. CBS also reported that the family had ties to Washington and that Mohammed Al-Khayyat had pushed U.S. lawmakers on Syria sanctions while also floating the idea of a Trump-branded golf course in Syria. Meanwhile, NPR reported that investigative journalists in Albania had been tracing a very complicated ownership trail through shell companies stretching from Albania to the Netherlands. This same NPR article also shares that the Al-Khayyat brothers control Albania Land Development, Sazan Land Holding, and Sazan Development Holding, all linked to the land acquisition in Albania. NPR also reported that Affinity Partners denied formal involvement, saying partners were acting in their own personal capacity. But BalkanWeb.com reported Ramez Al-Khayyat saying the parties were investing in the holding company together and managing it together. I want to share with you an excerpt from the article that's really telling. Quote, while Kushner is the public face of the project, records filed with the CBC show that the implementing company, Sazan Operations, founded on April 1st in Albania, is 100% controlled by two billionaire brothers, Ramiz and Mohammed Al-Khayyat, with their businesses based in Qatar. Ownership is, however, exercised through a network of 6 foreign companies, which each own each other in a cascade manner. One of the related companies, Blue Industries Investment Holding BV, registered in the Netherlands, has 5 unknown Albanian shareholders, whose 24% stake allows them to remain hidden from the register of ultimate beneficiaries. So to me, the obvious question now is Edi Rama one of those shareholders? Is this what's in it for him? Like, is this how he's going to get paid? Is by being a shareholder of this company? I don't know. That's a pretty damning piece of information, though. I have no proof, but that is what comes to mind for me. Okay, so now here's where it gets even more interesting. The Architects newspaper identified Affinity Partners, Assets Group, and Sazan Real Estate Development in the project structure. And according to IB Times UK, Ivanka Trump traveled to Albania in January 2025 to meet Ramiz Al-Khayyat alongside architects and, you guessed it, Albanian Prime Minister Edi Rama to discuss this project's design. That contradiction is one of the most important facts in this whole episode. One version says that this was personal. Another version says it was a joint venture. And when politically sensitive deals are routed through layered companies, while the public record contains conflicting explanations, that is not just a side detail, friend. That is the structure of the story. All right, friend, grab your passport because we're about to leave Albania and now we're going to Syria. Because this is where the question stops being simply who invested with whom and becomes who benefits when policy changes. So IB Times UK, who summarized wider reporting on this topic, said that Mohammed Al-Khayyat was tied to a family business connected to more than $12 billion in Syrian government-sponsored reconstruction contracts. It's also reported that the family attended high-level inauguration events and they pushed for the repeal of the Syria Civilian Protection Act. This is from the UB Times UK article. Mohammed Al-Khayyat allegedly used a Trump-branded golf course, an engraved foundation stone, and a multi-billion-pound resort partnership to curry favor with Washington insiders. At the center of the account is Mohammed Al-Khayyat, one of 3 brothers whose family business is linked to more than $12 billion in Syrian government-sponsored reconstruction contracts. An investigation by the New York Times, published on April 19, 2026, traced how the family allegedly leveraged the Trump name as a tool of political negotiation, cultivating at least a dozen members of Congress while their company's fortunes depended on dismantling a sanctions law that blocked international financing of the Syrian rebuild. Okay, so that was the excerpt. In December 2025, President Trump signed the FY 2026 National Defense Authorization Act. Section 8369 of the Act repealed the Syria Civilian Protection Act of 2019. So the bill that imposed comprehensive sanctions on Syria, the Senate had passed it 77-20. That matters because sanctions are not abstract. Sanctions decide whether money can move, whether banks can finance details, whether reconstruction projects can scale, and whether connected firms can profit. So when the same network appears both around sanctions politics and around commercial opportunities that depend on sanctions relief, the public should ask whether policy and profit were becoming intertwined. Then, add to that the reporting from the Kleptocracy, who found no obvious FARA or Foreign Agents Registration Act filing or standard lobbying trail for the Al-Khayyat network around Syria policy. Instead, the Al-Khayyats invested in Jared Kushner. Now, this isn't proof that the law was broken, but it does point to a different kind of influence model now, doesn't it? It's no longer like old school lobbying. It's private capital, business partnership, political intimacy, and access that does not move through the most visible disclosure systems. The Israel thread makes this pattern even harder to dismiss. Middle East Eye reported that Affinity became the largest shareholder in Phoenix Holdings, an Israeli company whose holdings included businesses identified by the UN as linked to illegal settlement activity in the West Bank. Let's not forget that Jared Kushner is an avid Zionist, and he now owns 10% stake in Phoenix Financial. The Business and Human Rights Resource Center independently tracked that reporting as well. This is where the Abraham Accords story starts to look a little bit different. It's not just about diplomacy anymore. It is now an infrastructure for deals. The website globes.co.il was unusually direct in describing Jared Kushner's effort to build a regional business empire and investment corridor between Gulf capital and Israel. And NPR quoted ethics concerns about doing business with regional governments while also playing a role in diplomacy with those same governments. So the question becomes pretty simple here, doesn't it? Were these relationships only diplomatic? Or were they also laying the foundation for a private financial pipeline that the same politically connected people would later benefit from? Then there's Gaza. This may be where the story becomes the most disturbing. ABC News reported that Kushner unveiled a master plan for post-war Gaza redevelopment with towers, industrial zones, residential districts, and luxury coastal development. From the article itself, Kushner, who has been part of the Gaza peace negotiations, suggested that construction would be done in just 2 or 3 years. The Board of Peace estimates that the plan would require more than $25 billion to develop modern utilities and public services. Now here's some other perspectives on that. The website Responsible Statecraft warned that the same network of well-connected actors could be positioned to benefit from the reconstruction. And Middle East Eye connected Gulf-backed Affinity Capital to Israeli investments, including ties to defense-related infrastructure. And this, my friend, is where the whole pattern starts to really snap into focus. Diplomacy creates openings. War destroys territory. Reconstruction creates profit opportunities. And the same network remains close to every step. Now, that doesn't prove that every project is corrupt, but it absolutely justifies some public scrutiny. Because when the same people are near the policy, the capital, and the redevelopment, conflict of interest concerns are not speculative at this point. They are structural. A big reason this story is so hard for the public to follow is that the American oversight system was not built for influence that moves like this. That Wyden letter that I mentioned earlier argued that private investment firms can exploit disclosure loopholes that allow foreign actors to pay politically exposed Americans through investment relationships without the level of transparency that the public would expect. Then there's a regulatory backdrop. The Treasury announcement delaying parts of anti-money laundering rulemaking became part of the concern because it suggested that the rules were lagging behind the very kind of structure now at issue. And by 2026, the scrutiny had escalated even further. The Raskin investigation announcement and Raskin letter framed Kushner's foreign entanglements as a live conflict of interest problem tied to diplomacy. And that is the real takeaway. The public has rules for registered lobbyists. The public has rules for campaign donations. And the public has rules for disclosed contracts. But what happens when influence travels through a sovereign wealth fund into the firm of a politically connected insider who moves between business, diplomacy, and presidential access? That is a much harder system to police. And that is why this story and this topic matters. So here's the through line. The Saudi funding raises the question of whether foreign governments were buying more than just financial management. The Al-Khayyat connection links Gulf business power to both Albania and Syria. The Albania project shows a very murky structure with conflicting public explanations. The Syria story raises the question of whether sanctions policy and reconstruction profits were moving closer together than the public was told. The Israel investments suggest that the Abraham Accords may have also functioned as a business corridor. And the Gaza plans raise the possibility that war, diplomacy, and redevelopment profits are being shaped by the same network. And the oversight record that shows that Congress itself does not see these concerns as fringe. So this should not be understood as gossiping or gossip about powerful people knowing each other. It should be understood as a case study in how foreign influence may now move through private investment structures that look normal enough to operate, but opaque enough to avoid meaningful public accountability. And if the same Saudi government can help finance the family network around Trump while also holding strategic weight in the very diplomatic deals Trump is publicly shaping, then the corruption concern is not subtle. It is visible, it is structural, and it's happening in broad daylight. Because the real scandal may not be that this arrangement existed. The real scandal may be how normal it was allowed to look.